The particular course of his reading while at Oxford, and during the time of vacation which he passed at home, cannot be traced. Enough has been said of his irregular mode of study. He told me that from his earliest years he loved to read poetry, but hardly ever read any poem to an end. That he read Shakespeare at a period so early that the speech of the ghost in Hamlet terrified him when he was alone. That Horace's odes were the compositions in which he took most delight, and it was long before he liked his epistles and satires. He told me what he read solidly at Oxford was Greek, not the Grecian historians, but Homer and Euripides, and now and then a little epigram. That the study of which he was the most fond was metaphysics, but he had not read much, even in that way. I always thought that he did himself injustice in his account of what he had read, and that he must have been speaking with reference to the vast portion of study which is possible, and to which a few scholars in the whole history of literature have attained. For when I once asked him whether a person whose name I had now forgotten studied hard, he answered, "No, sir, I do not believe he studied hard. I never knew a man who studied hard." I conclude, indeed, from the effects that some men have studied hard, as Bentley and Clark. Trying to him by that criterion upon which he formed his judgment of others, we may be absolutely certain, both from his writing and his conversation, that his reading was very extensive. Dr. Adam Smith, than whom few words better judges on the subject, once observed to me that Johnson knew more books than any man alive. He had a peculiar facility in seizing at once what was valuable in any book, without submitting to the labor of perusing it from the beginning to an end. So he was a speed reader. He had, from the irritability of his constitution, at all times an impatience and hurry when he either read or wrote. A certain apprehension, rising from novelty, made him write his first exercise at college twice over, but he never took that trouble with any other composition. And we shall see that his most excellent works were struck off at a heat, with rapid exertion. Footnote here. He told Dr. Burney, that he never wrote any of his works that were printed twice over. Dr. Burney's wonder at seeing several pages of his Lives of the Poets in manuscript, with scarce a blot of erasure, drew this observation from him. Yet he appears, from his early notes of memorandums in my possession, to have at various times attempted, or at least planned, a methodical course of study, according to computation, of which he was all his life fond, as it fixed his attention steadily upon something without, and prevented his mind from preying upon itself. Thus I find in his handwriting the number of lines in each of two of Euripides' tragedies, of the Georgics of Virgil, of the first 6 books of the Aeneid, of Horace's Art of Poetry, of 3 of the books of Ovid's Metamorphoses, of some parts of Theocritus, and of the 10th satire of Juvenal, and a table showing at the rate of various numbers a day, I suppose verses to be read, what would be in each case the total amount in a week, month, and a year. No man has a more ardent love of literature or a higher respect for it than Johnson. His apartment in Pembroke College was that upon the 2nd floor, over the gateway. The enthusiasts of learning will ever contemplate it with veneration. One day, while he was sitting in it quite alone, Dr. Panting, then master of the college, whom he called a fine Jacobite fellow, overheard him uttering this soliloquy in a strong, emphatic voice. "Well, I have a mind to see what is done in other places of learning. I'll go and visit the universities abroad. I'll go to France and Italy. I'll go to Padua. And I'll mind my business. For an Athenian blockhead is the worst of all blockheads." Footnote here. I had this anecdote from Dr. Adams, and Dr. Johnson confirmed it. Bromson, in his Man of Taste, had the same thought. Sure, of all blockheads, scholars are the worst. Dr. Adams told me that Johnson, while he was at Pembroke College, was caressed and loved by all about him, was a gay and frolicsome fellow, and passed there the happiest part of his life. But this is a striking proof of the fallacy of appearances, and now how little any of us know of the real internal state, even of those whom we see most frequently. For the truth is that he was then depressed by poverty and irritated by disease. When I mentioned to him this account as given me by Dr. Adams, he said, "Ah, sir, I was mad and violent. It was bitterness which they mistook for frolic. I was miserably poor, and I thought to fight my way by my literature and my wit. So I disregarded all power and all authority." The Bishop of Dromore observes in a letter to me, "The pleasure he took in vexing the tutors and fellows was been often mentioned, but I have heard him say what ought to be recorded to the honor of the present venerable master of that college, the Reverend William Adams, D.D., who was then very young, and one of the junior fellows, that the mild but judicious expostulations of this worthy man, whose virtue awed him, and whose learning he revered, made him really ashamed of himself. Though I fear," said he, "I was too proud to own it." I have heard from some of the contemporaries that he was generally seen lounging at the college gate, with a circle of young students around him, whom he was entertaining with wit, and keeping from their studies, if not spiriting them up to rebellion against the college discipline, which in his mature years he so much extolled. He was early begun to attempt keeping notes or memorandums by way of a diary of his life. I find in a parcel of loose leaves the following spirited resolution to contend against his natural indolence. October 1729. Decide valedixi serenus istius cantibus surdam post hoc orum observis. I bid farewell to sloth, being resolved henceforth not to listen to her siren strains. I have also in my possession a few leaves of another libellus, or little book, entitled Annales, in which some of the early particulars of his history are registered in Latin. I do not find that he formed any close intimacies with his fellow collegians, but Dr. Adams told me that he contracted a love and regard of Pembroke College, which he retained to the last. A short time before his death, he sent to the college a present of all his works to be deposited in their library, and he had thoughts of leaving it to his house at Lichfield. But his friends who were about him very properly dissuaded him from it, and he bequeathed it to some poor relations. He took a pleasure in boasting of the many eminent men who had been educated at Pembroke. In this list are found the names of Mr. Hawkins, the poetry professor, Mr. Shenstone, Sir William Blackstone, and others. See Nash's History of Worcester, Volume 1, page 529 for more, if you're so inclined. Not forgetting the celebrated popular preacher, Mr. George Whitefield, of whom, though Dr. Johnson did not think very highly, it must be acknowledged that his eloquence was powerful, his views pious and charitable, his assiduity almost incredible, and that since his death, the integrity of his character has been fully vindicated. Being himself a poet, Johnson was peculiarly happy in mentioning how many of the sons of Pembroke were poets, adding, with a smile of sportive triumph, "Sir, we are a nest of singing birds." He was not, however, blind to what he thought the defects of his own college, and I have, from the information of Dr. Taylor, a very strong instance of the rigid honesty which he ever inflexibly preserved. Taylor had obtained his father's consent to be entered of Pembroke, that he might be with his schoolfellow Johnson, with whom, though some years older than himself, he was very intimate. This would have been a great comfort to Johnson, but he fairly told Taylor that he could not, in conscience, suffer him to enter where he knew he would not have an able tutor. He then made inquiry all around the university, and having found that Mr. Bateman of Christ Church was a tutor of highest reputation, Taylor was entered of that college. Mr. Bateman's lectures were so excellent that Johnson used to come and get them at second hand from Taylor, till his poverty being so extreme that his shoes were worn out and his feet peered through them, he saw that this humiliating circumstance was perceived by the Christ Churchmen, and he came no more. He was too proud to accept of money, and somebody, perhaps the Reverend William Vyse, having sent a pair of new shoes at his door, he threw them away with indignation. How must we feel when we read such an anecdote of Samuel Johnson? Excuse me. The spirited refusal of an eleemosynary supply of shoes arose, no doubt, from a proper pride. I've never seen this word before in my life. eleemosynary. That's a new one. But considering his aesthetic dispositions at times, as acknowledged by himself in his meditations, and the exaggerations with which some have treated the peculiarities of his character, I should not wonder to hear it ascribed to a principle of superstitious mortification. As we are told by Tertullianus in his Life of St. Ignatius Loyola, that this intrepid founder of the order of Jesuits, when he arrived at Goa, after having made a severe pilgrimage through the eastern deserts, persisted in wearing his miserable shattered shoes, and when new shoes were offered him, rejected them as an unsuitable indulgence. The res Augusta domi, narrow means of home, Juvenal, prevented him from having the advantage of a complete academical education. The friend to whom he had trusted for support had deceived him. His debts in college, though not great, were increasing, and his scanty remittances from Lichfield, which had all along been made with great difficulty, could be supplied no longer, his father having fallen into a state of insolvency. Compelled, therefore, by irresistible necessity, he left the college in autumn, 1731, without a degree, having been a member of it little more than 3 years. Wow. Dr. Adams, the worthy and respectable master of Pembroke College, has generally had the reputation of being Johnson's tutor. The fact, however, is that in 1731 Mr. Jordan quitted the college, and his pupils were transferred to Dr. Adams, so that, had Johnson returned, Dr. Adams would have been his tutor. It is to be wished that this connection had taken place. His equal temper, mild disposition, and politeness of manners might have insensibly softened the harshness of Johnson, and infused into him those more delicate charities, those petites morales, in which, it must be confessed, our great moralist was more deficient than his best friends could fully justify. Dr. Adams paid Johnson this high compliment. He said to me at Oxford in 1776, I was his nominal tutor, but he was above my mark. When I repeated it to Johnson, his eyes flashed with a grateful satisfaction, and he exclaimed, That was liberal and noble. And now, I had almost said poor Samuel Johnson returned to his native city, destitute, and not knowing how he should gain even a decent livelihood. His father's misfortunes in trade rendered him unable to support his son, and for some time there appeared no means by which he could maintain himself. In December of this year, his father died. The state of poverty in which he died appears from a note in one of Johnson's little diaries of the following year, which strongly displays his spirit and virtuous dignity of mind. 1732, July 15th. Andisem horas deposuae, quo di quidquid ante matris funis, quod serum sit precor, de paternis bonis speradae licit, vehente silit libra seceptae, usque adio mihi fortuna finguda est. Interia no papertarte vires anime languescant nic in flagitia egestas abigat cavidam. I laid my 11 guineas on this day, when I received 20 pounds, being all that I have reason to hope for out of my father's effects, previous to the death of my mother. An event which I pray God may be very remote. I now, therefore, see that I must make my own fortune. Meanwhile, let me take care that the powers of my mind may not be debilitated by poverty, and that indignities do not force me into any criminal act. Johnson was so far fortunate that the respectable character of his parents and his own merit had, for his earliest years, secured him a kind reception in the best families at Lichfield. Among them I can mention Mr. Howard, Dr. Swinfen, Mr. Simpson, Mr. Levitt, Captain Garrick, father of the great ornament of the British stage, but above all, Mr. Gilbert Walmsley. Mr. Warden informs me that this early friend of Johnson was entered a commoner of Trinity College, Oxford, which is where I went, briefly, age 17 in 1698, and is the author of many Latin verse translations of the Gent Madge. One of them is a translation of My time, O ye muses, very happily spent, etc. He died August 3rd, 1751, and a monument to his memory has been erected in the Cathedral of Lichfield with an inscription written by Mr. Seward, one of the prebendaries. Anyway, Mr. Gilbert Walmsley, Register of the Prerogative Court of Lichfield, whose character, long after his decease, Dr. Johnson has, in his life of Edmund Smith, thus drawn in the glowing colors of gratitude. Quoted from that, I believe. Of Gilbert Walmsley, this presented to my mind, let me indulge myself in the remembrance. I knew him very early. He was one of the first friends that literature procured me, and I hope that at least my gratitude made me worthy of his notice. He was of an advanced age, and I was only not a boy. Yet he never received my notion with contempt. He was a Whig, with all the virulence and malevolence of his party. Yet difference of opinion did not keep us apart. I entered him, and he endured me. He has mingled with the gay world without exemption from its vices or its follies, but had never neglected this cultivation of his mind. His belief of revelation was unshaken. His learning preserved his principles. He grew first regular and then pious. His studies have been so various that I am not able to name a man of equal knowledge. His acquaintance with books was great, and what he did not immediately know he could at least tell where to find. Such was his amplitude of learning, and such his copiousness of communication, that it may be doubted whether a day now passes in which I have not some advantage from his friendship. At this man's table I enjoyed many cheerful and instructive hours with companions, such as are not often found, with one who was lengthened and one who has gladdened life, with Dr. James, whose skill in psychic and physics will be long remembered, and with David Garrick, whom I hope to have gratified with this character of our common friend. But what are the hopes of man? I am disappointed by the stroke of death, which has eclipsed the gaiety of nations and impoverished the public stock of harmless pleasure. In these families he passed much time in his early years. In most of them he was in the company of ladies, particularly at Mr. Walmsley's, whose wife and sisters-in-law, of the name of Aston, and daughters of a baronet, were remarkable for a good breeding, so that the notion which had been industriously circulated and believed that he never was in good company till late in life, and consequently had been confirmed in coarse and ferocious manners by long habits, is wholly without foundation. Some of the ladies have assured me that they recollect him well when a young man, as distinguished from his complaisance. Okay, that's it for today. Till next time, bye from Boswell.